So hello. Well, I've had some big deals this year in terms of car launches, but there's something about a new 911, isn't there? I mean, this platform, the 911 as we know it, is, I think it's 55 years old. It's certainly over 50 years old anyway. And the ethos of the 911 has always been evolution, not revolution. There's no exception with the 992 generation we're sat in right now. So let's get straight to it. With the engine, I think that's how we should start really, because let's face it, Porsche, while there are smatterings of luxury and practicality, it is synonymous with performance. Now this is actually where it gets immediately interesting. So the new 992 generation, I'm currently sat in the 4S. Porsche are launching it with the S range first. There will be a standard Carrera launching later on next year and manual variants, but we're launching with the S. The significant thing is that the S is picking up where the GTS from the 991 generation car finished. What I'm trying to say is this car has 450 brake horsepower. Now I know in this day and age of supercar figures that doesn't sound a lot, but you've got to remember this is the 4S and it's comparable with the outgoing GTS, which is a phenomenal car. The engine is running the familiar 3-litre flat-six turbocharged engine. Again, out of the GTS. The resultant upgrades places this thing at a 0 to 62 figure of 4 seconds flat. We're now pushing some pretty serious performance for a car that is not too far away from their entry-level model. So power is up by 30 horsepower and also torque is up by 30 Newton meters of torque. And that is ultimately what is great about these turbocharged engines, is the effortless nature of how they pick up momentum. Torque is that wonderful twisting, almost tangible energy that we're getting from modern day turbocharged engines, and they've gone and upped it some more, which is why I'm very excited for the future of this new platform. Think about it, if the near entry level version of the car is starting at 450 horsepower, think about where the Turbo S and the GT products of this platform will end up going. It's going to be ridiculous. Of course, what connects all of that power to the wheels is the transmission, is the gearbox. And here is some very interesting developments indeed. First of all, we see the introduction of an 8-speed gearbox. I mean, how many more gears do you need? 7 was enough when they introduced the PDK, but now we have 8. And of course, you guessed it, the reason for that is for efficiency. Every manufacturer and his dog is having to adapt to the ever-evolving emissions regulations. And you guessed it, that 8th gear is all to do with that. It is final drive, which is just one of the elements that Porsche have added to this car in order to meet those new, very strict emissions regulations. But there's something else which tips its hat towards the future of where this platform might head, is that Porsche have strategically left space for an electric engine. Now that doesn't mean that we are going to see an all-electric 911 anytime soon. In fact, I'm reassured by Porsche that there will be no fully autonomous 911 and that they will always have a steering wheel. I know that sounds crazy, but in this day and age we are quickly heading that way. And that what is core to the feeling of a true 911 is of course an engine, in terms of one that combusts dinosaur juice. But once again, in order to prepare themselves for, as I mentioned, the ever-evolving CO2 emissions rules and regulations, they've made way for an electric engine to complement the petrol-powered engine. So we might very well see a plug-in hybrid version of the 911 in future. So yeah, new gearbox, 8-speed, still a twin-clutch PDK, but room for hybrid as well. Now think about it, this already has a huge amount of torque from that turbocharged engine. Imagine if they plug a hybrid onto it as well. Like the throttle response and the torque is going to be instantaneous. I'm actually really excited for the prospect of that. For me, if they bolt the two together and we have a wonderfully responsive turbocharged hybrid engine, all the more power to them. So, what's it all packaged in? Well, interestingly, in the past, Porsche have typically offered a narrow body and wider body options. The narrow bodies have always been reserved for the rear wheel drive only cars. We're currently sat in the 4S and it has the wider bodied car. In fact, it looks similar in stance to the 991 Turbo S. It really has wonderfully flared arches. I'm not sure whether it's the paint or not, because I'm told that it's just the front arches which are a bit wider and that the rear arches have maintained a similar stance. But to my eyes, I mean, looking at them in these wing mirrors, they are huge. It looks fantastic. Now the cool thing is, it doesn't matter if you go for rear wheel drive or four wheel drive, all of these models are going to be coming with the same body size, which is effectively a wider bodied stance, which means your 911s are always going to look aesthetically awesome, at least to my eyes anyway. And I assume therefore that the turbo versions and the GT products, like the upcoming GT3 and hopefully, who knows, one day the next GT2 RS, will be even wider. Which, take it from me, to my eyes, this thing looks so good, even at this level. So this is why I'm saying the future of this platform really excites me. Now, together with the wider body, we also have bigger wheels. For the first time on the Carrera model cars, we have larger rear wheels compared with the front wheels. So we've got 21-inch rears and 20-inch fronts. Once again, you stand back from this thing and you're looking at it thinking, why is this thing looking so good? And all of these little additions, slightly wider, bigger rear wheels, it's just set off the stance wonderfully. It really is a very beautiful car. So what's new about the engine? Well, we have an all-new intake system, new injectors and intercoolers, as well as particulate filters in the exhaust. So it's got more features and more additional components, but they've managed to maintain a very similar weight. I was just speaking to someone from the Porsche team earlier, and they were saying that this car is 5 seconds faster around the Nürburgring than the outgoing Carrera 4S. Now, 5 seconds in terms of lap times is otherworldly. You know, so it just shows that even though the weight is the same, the components and things like the added torque, wider body, more mechanical grip really adds up to fundamental driving changes. No doubt this thing is going to be a road weapon. I can't wait to experience it. Let's move on just quickly to the interior. Now, I'm gonna talk about cup holders because I know this sounds a crazy thing to talk about in a sports car, but actually, for me, the 911 platform is the benchmark for a sports car that you can use daily. And as part of that, let's face it, we use cup holders. Now, I've always joked that the cup holders are in the 997 generation and the 991 generation, where they sort of have this like folding origami effect, how they just sort of appear out of the dashboard. It's really cool. It doesn't take up any space in the car, and I've always joked that they are conveniently placed next to the air vents. So if you want to keep your drink cold, you can crank up the aircon and keep it cool, and equally if you want to keep it warm, you can crank up the heat, and really it does work. I've been on road trips where it's perfectly placed and it keeps my can cold. And I've always really liked them. Now, listen, this isn't a defining feature of a car, but what's interesting is that because there has been such a fundamental redesign of the dashboard, they have done away with the origami cup holders, and the primary holder is now in the central console and right in the center of said central console. Now, at first glance, that might not look like a problem, but there is going to be a manual version of this car soon, and I'm wondering if they're going to maintain the placement of that holder right there, because the chances are that's going to be pretty impractical stuff. In terms of interacting with changing gears, what I've always liked about Porsche is that despite the fact that the paddle shifters are connected to the wheel, so that when you move the wheel, the paddles move as well. Now, oftentimes when you're crossed up, if you're coming out of a tight junction, or I don't know, you might just so happen to find yourself going sideways, it's always been really convenient to have the ability to shift gears where the conventional gear stick would be. Now, in the case of the PDK gearbox, you're able to just knock it either backwards or forwards to change that gear, which is great when you're coming out of a tight corner and your hands are all crossed up. You can just knock that gear shifter and get into the gear you want. Now, interestingly, Porsche have applied more of a drive select switch rather than the more conventional gear stick. Now, by and large, this isn't going to be a problem, but I live with a Porsche GT3 and I'm very familiar with interacting with these cars, and I have found it super handy. As I mentioned, that when I'm coming out of a tight junction and you can't quite get that paddle, you have the option to just tap up or down a gear depending on how you want it. It looks to me like on this little switch here, it's probably not gonna be an option. So We'll see how that plays out in the long run. Who knows as well what application they'll come up with in their GT product cars. But for now, let's see how it plays out. Now let's talk about the dash and infotainment. Now Porsche purists will be familiar with the 5-instrument cluster layout. So typically in the middle you have your rev counter, and then to the left of that you have your speedo, and then to the right of that you can have like temperature gauges and things like that, depending on the particular car you're in. Now interestingly, Porsche have kind of cleverly maintained that, but the only analog mechanical instrument cluster that is left is the rev counter in the middle of the car. They have simulated the other instrument displays using screens. That 5 cluster layout is still there, albeit only one of them's real. The rest of them are digital. You know, listen, it's not a big problem. It's just interesting that this is the first time we just have pretty much pure screen. Obviously, it allows you to customize the dashboard more if you wanted to have sat nav there, or any other information like your music channels or lap time, whatever you want. You can have it on here, fuel levels, etc. But interestingly, we also now have a massive screen over here in the central console, and it's colossal, and it's super crisp and super clear. In terms of interacting with it, I can already tell that I prefer it. Now, I have the sort of facelift interior on my GT3, very intuitive, but having jumped in and out of more modern day Porsches of late, it is starting to feel just slightly dated. Now, a GT product car, you don't really mind because you're kind of focused purely on driving. But when you're in a car which is a more daily driver, it's these little things that add up to make you feel like you're really in something new. But speaking of tech, there will also be the introduction of assistance systems, such as lane keeping assist, which can warn you if you were to leave your lane unintentionally. Lane departure warning, night vision, etc. Things that you might not necessarily associate with a sports car, now making its way into 992, 911. Always a bonus. Now, in terms of aesthetics, I want to specifically talk about the rear of the car. I know I've spoken about the stance and the wider body and things like that, but as I mentioned at the beginning, new Porsches have typically always been about evolution, not revolution. However, the most outstanding design changes, for me certainly, are at the rear of the car. It looks completely new. It's not until you get up close to it that you realize the sort of depth of the sculpture and the features on the rear have really changed the whole contours of the way that the back of this car sits. Things like the Porsche logo. It consists of these really thick, almost 3D letter characters that go across the car, and the housing upon which those letters sit is quite a deep crevice, and it's these sort of things which have added to contours within the back of the car that have made it stand out. And then we get to the wing. Now, the wing is activated at certain speeds, and for the first time, Porsche are also using this wing as an air brake. And why this is more effective is that that wing is now 25% larger than previous active wings on 911s. And it's not until you see it pop out that you realize that it is a good chunk larger. And once again, aesthetically, looks awesome. And when you move down to the lower half of the rear bumper, you'll notice that they've moved the number plate placement down between the two exhaust tips. Just while we're on the topic of exhaust tips, is it just me, or does that have DNA traits of GT2 about it? But yes, they've moved the plate down between the exhaust tips, and so you've got this more symmetrical feeling about it, where the plate is in its own sort of housing unit, leaving this cleaner surface just above where the number plate would have typically sat. But of course, we can't just discuss the rear. The front has also been revised as well, and where the air intakes are, there is actually somewhat of an active aero element about it. There are these flaps which open and close in order to reduce drag or increase cooling. The predominant reason behind that in this particular model is mostly for efficiency from the reduction of drag side of things, but who doesn't love some active aero? And one more time with the aesthetics, you might also notice the entirely new door handles. May not seem like a big deal, but these door handles now fit way more flush with the bodywork. And how it works is when you come over to the car, they kind of pop out somewhat, allowing you to actually open the door. And then once you're back in, or once you've left the car, they then recess a lot more against the bodywork for just a tighter, flusher finish. Once again, looks really cool. But of course, when it's all said and done, for me and probably you, a Porsche 911 is still all about the drive. Now, when I opened the door and I sat myself down in this car, importantly, through and through, this still felt like a Porsche. It still felt like a 911. I'm sat nice and low. I've got the support under my thighs, which I personally love out of a driving position. We've got this small diameter steering wheel, which as soon as you hold it, gives you this sort of sense of connection without even turning the car on. I just grab it and I'm like, yeah, that feels right. You know, what the effect of a slightly smaller diameter wheel does is enhance the feeling of agility. It feels like you're taking control of something nimble and light on its toes. And it feels like that even when I'm sat in the studio. It's quite weird. And then these seats, despite the fact that these are the more comfort-orientated sports seats that you could easily drive every single day, it still feels like they're there for you. They hug you and support you nicely. As a driver, you just feel immediately at home, and I'm really glad that I can still feel that DNA when I sit in the car. So that was the very first look at the brand new 992 generation 911. Now, as I mentioned, this is the 911 Carrera 4S. They're going to be introducing a manual version next year. We're also going to be seeing the standard Carrera version coming, and then inevitably all of the other variants that spin off of that. I am super excited for this platform. As we mentioned, don't forget they have left room for a hybrid unit, so it'll be interesting to see if they apply that further down the line. And we're expecting to see the GT variants of this car within 12 to 18 months. So Porsche won't be hanging around. We're going to be seeing a lot more from this platform soon. If I haven't addressed anything, please let me know in the comments below, and I shall send Porsche a very kind email to say, well, clearly I need to come on the first drive of this car because my audience needs to know stuff. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. Ciao.